Rachel Pierce never doubted her husband, until the night she followed Mark to a crumbling hotel on the edge of town, and saw him enter room 2114 with a woman who was supposed to be missing. What she uncovered behind that door wasn't just betrayal, it was a web of lies, a hidden basement, and a chilling trail of victims. As Detective Lena Cruz races to connect the dots, and a fragile Emily Harper is pulled from the shadows of captivity, one question haunts them all: was Mark Pierce the true mastermind, or just a puppet for someone far more dangerous still watching from the dark? Rachel Pierce had always believed her life was normal, predictable even. She worked as a freelance editor from their quiet suburban home, and her husband Mark, a systems analyst, maintained the same steady routine for years. They were the kind of couple neighbors waved to and strangers didn't look at twice. But over the past several weeks, something in that peaceful pattern had started to fray. It began with small, almost forgettable things. Mark, once punctual to a fault, started coming home late without explanation. He blamed traffic, a server crash, or last-minute meetings. Rachel accepted it at first. After all, Mark wasn't the type to lie, or so she thought. But then there were the phone calls. They always came after 10 p.m., just as Rachel was settling into bed. Mark would step outside into the backyard, or take the call in his car with the engine off. Once she caught a glimpse of his screen. It wasn't saved as a contact, just a string of numbers, and then there was the texting, silent, frequent, and followed by quick swipes to delete everything. Rachel noticed but said nothing. She didn't want to be that wife. Still, the feeling lingered, a quiet unease that started to wrap itself around her thoughts, refusing to let go. She started paying closer attention. One morning while folding laundry, Rachel noticed something odd. Mark's shirt smelled faintly of perfume, not hers. A floral scent too sweet and sharp to be mistaken. Another night, she noticed he shaved before heading to what he said was a late meeting. He never did that. Not for work. She told herself she was overthinking, letting paranoia plant seeds where there was no proof. But each day the garden of doubt grew. The final push came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Mark came home earlier than usual and tossed his jacket on the couch before disappearing into the bathroom. Rachel, driven by a need she didn't recognize, reached into his jacket pocket. Her fingers brushed against a stiff piece of plastic. She pulled out a hotel keycard, unmarked, generic, but undeniably real. Her breath caught. Mark hadn't said anything about a hotel. There was no conference, no trip. She placed the card back exactly as she'd found it and waited. That night, she barely slept. Her mind spun in circles. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it was work-related. Maybe she didn't believe any of it. The next day, she searched online and discovered the card matched the branding of a small hotel on the edge of the city, the Linden Crest. It wasn't the kind of place for business travelers. It was secluded, outdated, mostly used by couples seeking privacy. 3 nights later, Mark left again. No explanations, no details, just a text. Working late, don't wait up. Rachel didn't hesitate. She waited 15 minutes after he left, then grabbed her coat, her keys, and quietly followed him in her car. The rain fell steadily, washing the streets in slick reflections of red and white light. She kept a cautious distance, careful not to get too close. Mark drove with the calm ease of someone who had done this before, that only made her chest tighten. Eventually he pulled into the side lot of the Linden Crest Hotel. Rachel parked 2 cars away, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. She watched as Mark stepped out, glanced around, and disappeared into the building. There was no suitcase, no laptop, just him moving with a kind of casual confidence that made her stomach twist. She sat there, soaked in silence, heart racing, mind screaming. What was he doing there? Who was he meeting? She had never felt more afraid and never more certain. Something was wrong, terribly, unmistakably wrong. Rachel waited in the car, gripping the steering wheel as the wipers swiped back and forth in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Her heartbeat drummed in her ears, faster than the rain tapping the windshield. The Linden Crest Hotel looked like it had once been grand, decades ago. Now it stood tucked between a gas station and a closed antique store, its cracked sign flickering in and out. The building was 3 stories tall, the paint peeling, the lights dim behind dusty windows. It was quiet. Too quiet for a place that should be welcoming guests. She checked the time, 10:13 p.m. Mark had gone in 5 minutes ago. No one else had entered. No one had exited. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a lone delivery van and an old Buick covered in grime. Her mind raced. Was he meeting someone? A woman? Was this an affair? The thought sickened her. But another thought, colder and darker, began to take shape. What if this was something else entirely? Rachel couldn't just sit there. She had come for answers. She turned off the car, stepped out into the drizzle, and pulled her hood up. The air was heavy with the scent of wet concrete and mildew. Her footsteps were soft against the soaked pavement as she walked toward the lobby, trying to act like she belonged there. The entrance door creaked slightly when she pushed it open. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit by a yellowing chandelier. The wallpaper peeled in long strips near the corners, and a faint hum came from an old soda machine in the corner. No one stood at the front desk. A bell sat on the counter, but she didn't dare touch it. Behind the desk was a row of key hooks, though most of them were empty. She scanned them quickly. Room 214 had a hook, but no key. Trying not to draw attention to herself, Rachel moved toward the hallway, her eyes darting down the corridor. The hall was narrow, the carpet threadbare and stained. Dim lights flickered overhead. She passed room 200 some, then 202, her breath catching with every step. At 208 she heard a faint sound like a chair being dragged. She froze, then forced herself to keep moving. The numbers climbed slowly until finally she stood in front of. The door was closed, and there was no sound from inside. She leaned closer, her ear nearly touching the surface. For a moment, there was only silence. Then she heard it. A soft voice. A woman's voice. It was muffled but clear enough to tell it wasn't the television. It sounded like she was pleading. And then Mark's voice, lower, almost cold. Rachel's body tensed. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was off. Not intimate, not gentle. It was controlled, measured. Rachel's breath fogged the air in front of her. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. Her instinct screamed at her to get away, but her feet didn't move. She took a small step back, afraid that even her presence in the hallway could be discovered. Someone could open the door at any second. She held her breath. The voices inside grew fainter, then stopped altogether. She turned and walked back toward the lobby as fast as she could without running. When she stepped outside, the air felt colder than before. Her hands trembled as she opened her car door and got inside. Her mind was a storm. A woman was in that room, with Mark, but it hadn't sounded like a lover's secret meeting. It sounded like something else, something worse. She sat behind the wheel, drenched in confusion and dread. She had come expecting heartbreak. What she found instead felt far more dangerous. The key card, the secret visits, the woman's voice. It all pointed to something she didn't yet understand. Rachel wasn't sure what she had just witnessed, but she knew it wasn't an affair, and she was terrified to find out what it really was. Rachel sat motionless in her car, the engine humming quietly beneath her, the rain still falling in slow, steady sheets. Her mind spun like a carousel, looping the same haunting fragments over and over: the hotel room door, the muffled voices, the unmistakable sound of fear in the woman's tone. She had gone there expecting to catch her husband in a lie. But what she'd stumbled into felt far more sinister than infidelity. She didn't know what to do: confront him, go to the police, and say that she heard someone behind a hotel door. She drove home in silence, staring blankly at the wet roads, the lines on the pavement bending and blurring through the rain. Her house felt alien when she stepped inside. Too still, too quiet. She sat at the kitchen table, her phone in her hands, searching for anything that would make sense of what she'd heard. Her fingers hovered over a search bar. She didn't know what to type. Finally, almost without thinking, she entered the name of the hotel: Linden Crest Hotel New. Most results were uneventful. A few reviews, a 3-year-old article about the property being sold to a private owner, but then something caught her attention: a local community forum, clunky, unpolished, and outdated. A user had posted a thread titled "Weird Happenings at Linden Crest." It was full of speculation. People said they'd heard screaming late at night. Some claimed they'd seen people go in and never come out. It sounded like urban legend nonsense, until someone mentioned a name: Emily Harper. Rachel clicked on the thread and scrolled quickly. The search for Emily Harper consumed the entire department. Every lead was chased, every piece of evidence from the hotel held under a microscope. Rachel watched from a distance, barely sleeping, jumping at every unknown number that called her phone. A quiet fear lived inside her now, a constant pressure behind her ribs. She no longer saw Mark as the man she married. He was a stranger. No, worse than a stranger. A carefully constructed lie. Police obtained a warrant and returned to the Linden Crest Hotel, this time with purpose. Rachel wasn't there to see it, but Detective Lena Cruz later walked her through everything they found. The basement was locked behind a rusted steel door, one that Tony Maddox had claimed led to the boiler system, but behind that door was a world no guest had ever seen. The basement had no windows, it had no furniture, no signs of comfort. What it had was far more disturbing. There was a single room, windowless, concrete walls lit by a harsh overhead bulb that flickered with a sickening rhythm. A rusted cot sat against the wall, next to a bucket and a chain bolted to the floor. On the far wall, a corkboard held printed documents and photographs, similar to the ones Rachel had seen upstairs but far more graphic. Each photo was labeled with dates and initials. Audio tapes were found stacked in boxes nearby, each numbered and catalogued. Some were marked with names Rachel recognized from the missing persons reports. DNA testing later confirmed the presence of biological material from at least 2 missing women. One of them matched a cold case from a neighboring state, another woman who had disappeared without a trace, just like Emily. The other woman was never publicly identified. Whoever she was, she'd never come home. Still, there was no sign of Emily Harper. Rachel began to fear the worst. But Detective Cruz wasn't giving up. The detail that cracked the case came from one of the documents recovered in the basement. A note scribbled on the back of a receipt listed coordinates, latitude and longitude, with a single word written beneath. Investigators traced the coordinates to a remote island just off the coast, an hour's boat ride from the nearest port. It was barely more than a rock, a place with no residents, no official use, no reason for anyone to. And yet, as they arrived by helicopter 2 days later, they spotted what looked like a small shack built into the cliffside. Inside, they found her. Emily Harper was alive, barely. She was weak, dehydrated, and disoriented. Her wrists were bruised, her ankles scarred, but she was breathing. The officers found her seated on a mattress, her hands tied in front of her, eyes wide and unfocused. She hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. She could barely speak, but when asked her name, she whispered it with a hoarse voice. Emily. Rachel cried when she heard the news, relief mixed with horror. Emily had been held for months, moved from the hotel to this island, used for something unspeakable, and yet she had survived. The doctors said it was a miracle. Mark and Tony were arrested hours later at a private marina where they were preparing to leave the country. They had no idea the island had been discovered, no idea Emily was alive. They were calm when taken in, eerily calm, like men who believed they still had control, but their world was crumbling now. Rachel watched the news coverage with shaking hands, police cars, handcuffs, flashing lights. The face she once kissed every morning now shone on every channel, labeled a predator, a monster, a mastermind. The secrets were out, the dark web of lies unraveled. But even as Mark was taken away, one thought echoed in her mind. If she hadn't followed him that night, if she had looked away, Emily might never have been found, and others might have followed. 3 weeks after Emily Harper was rescued, a new mystery emerged, one that threatened to unravel everything the police thought they knew about Mark Pierce's twisted operation. While Mark and Tony Maddox sat in separate holding cells awaiting trial, refusing to speak, a package arrived at the police station. No return address, just a plain manila envelope, postmarked from a neighboring state. Inside was a flash drive. Detective Lena Cruz reviewed the footage first. Alone in her office, she locked the door, dimmed the lights, and pressed play. The video was raw and unsettling. It began with a shaky shot of the ocean, gray skies overhead, waves crashing against jagged rocks. The camera panned slowly to reveal a familiar lighthouse standing tall in the distance, one that matched the structure near the island where Emily had been found. The audio buzzed with wind and static. Then the camera cut to something else. Emily Harper, alive, sitting in a chair. A small room, dimly lit by a single bulb. Her hands weren't bound, but she wasn't moving. She stared blankly into the camera, blinking slowly. In the corner of the frame was a clock. The date showed it was recorded 2 days before the raid on the island. This wasn't surveillance footage from police. Someone had filmed her while she was still captive, and sent the footage after she'd already been rescued. Someone else had been watching. The revelation sent a shockwave through the investigation. Lena immediately ordered a review of every inch of the island, every item recovered. Had someone else been involved? Was there another person in the shadows, orchestrating things behind the scenes? Rachel, too, was brought in to view the footage. Watching it, she felt her throat tight. There was something strange about the way Emily looked at the camera, not like someone afraid, but like someone waiting. Like she knew someone was out there, watching her, maybe even helping her survive. Later that night, Rachel received a call from Detective Cruz. New information had surfaced. A storage unit, one not registered to Mark or Tony, had been linked to a third identity, an alias buried deep in financial records tied to a shared offshore account. The same alias appeared in the metadata of the video file, a digital signature hidden deep in the coding that matched none of the known suspects. Inside the new unit, police found a laptop, a burner phone, and stacks of unmarked files. But most shocking of all, there were surveillance photos of Rachel, walking to her car, at the grocery store, sitting in her backyard. She hadn't just stumbled into the truth, she had been part of it all along. Someone had been watching her ever since she started asking questions. Someone who knew she'd uncover the truth, someone who wanted her to. But Rachel felt the edges of her world begin to tremble again. What if this went deeper than Mark and Tony? What if they weren't the masterminds, just players following orders? What if she had only scratched the surface? Detective Cruz warned her to be careful. Until they knew who the third person was, no one was safe. Emily, still recovering in a secure location, had started speaking more. She mentioned a third voice, someone who gave orders but never showed their face. She called them the quiet one. Whoever that person was, they were still out there. Rachel lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the footage in her mind. She had stopped a monster. She had saved a life. But now she realized something far more terrifying. The real threat hadn't even shown their face yet, and they were watching. Still, the courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters, officers and quiet observers clutching notepads and whispers. The trial of Mark Pierce and Tony Maddox had drawn nationwide attention. What had once looked like the unraveling of a double life had revealed something much darker, a system of control, manipulation, and calculated silence. As Rachel sat quietly in the third row, her eyes fixed on the back of Mark's head, she felt a strange sense of separation. The man in front of her, shackled at the wrists, wasn't her husband. Not anymore. Mark sat still as the charges were read: kidnapping, false imprisonment, aggravated assault, unlawful surveillance, evidence tampering, conspiracy. The list went on, and with every count, his face remained blank. Tony Maddox avoided looking at anyone. His hands trembled visibly as the prosecution opened with images of room 2114 and the basement below the hotel. The photos were shown on large screens: syringes, chains, printed faces with red X's. Gasps filled the room. The jurors looked sick. Emily Harper, still too fragile to appear in person, submitted a written statement that was read aloud by her lawyer. Her words echoed across the courtroom like a distant cry from a dark place. She described the coldness of her captivity, the loneliness, the mental games she endured. Most chilling was her mention of the voice she heard through speakers in the room, a voice that instructed Mark and Tony on what to do next. She called it emotionless, robotic, always just out of reach. When the prosecution brought Rachel to the stand, the courtroom hushed. Her testimony was careful, but powerful. She described the night she followed Mark, what she saw, what she heard, and how she stepped inside room 214. Her voice didn't shake. She wanted the world to know that she hadn't stayed silent, that someone had chosen to look close. Then came the twist no one expected. Mark's defense didn't argue innocence, instead they blamed it all on the unknown third party. They claimed Mark had been manipulated, controlled by a larger force. Their arguments centered around the quiet one, the voice Emily heard, the digital traces on the flash drive, the anonymous packages sent to the police. The defense insisted Mark had been a puppet, not a mastermind. But then on the fifth day of trial everything changed. Mark asked to speak. The courtroom froze. His lawyer protested, but the judge allowed it. Mark stood, turned slowly, and addressed the court. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't express regret. What he gave was a confession, cold, complete, and horrifying. He detailed how he and Tony had recruited women they thought would not be missed, how they kept records, how they tested psychological thresholds, attempting to erase identities, break minds. He spoke of Emily as the one who almost broke, but did. He admitted to choosing women who had histories of trauma, instability, loneliness. He mentioned the third person only once. They showed us how, he said, but they were never in the room. We were the hands, they were the mind. The court fell silent after that. Mark's confession sealed the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Tony, who had remained silent throughout, was also convicted. Both were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, but even as justice was served, a chill remained. The identity of the quiet one was never uncovered. No fingerprints, no DNA, just a digital trail that led to a burner server overseas and disappeared into silence. No further packages arrived, no sightings, no voice on the line. Rachel moved away from the city not long after. Emily changed her name and entered a witness protection program. The hotel was torn down, but late at night when the world grew quiet, Rachel would still wonder, had they really caught the monster, or just the shadows it left behind?